July 18, 1944. St. Lo, Normandy. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. Across the hedgerow country of Lower Normandy, where ancient stone walls divided the fields into a patchwork of green fortresses, the morning sun burned through a haze of dust and cordite. In a sunken lane southeast of St. Lo, Obersturmführer Heinrich Wolf pressed his palm against the warm steel flank of his Panther tank and felt the engine's idle rumble travel through his bones. Around him, the men of the Panzer-Lehr Division, Germany's most elite armored formation, hand-picked veterans who had crushed Soviet Guards divisions at Kursk and broken British armor at Villers-Bocage, waited in their machines like coiled springs. They had been trained to believe that speed, firepower, and tactical brilliance could overcome any material disadvantage. They had conquered nations with those principles. Now, in the suffocating summer heat of France, they were about to learn a different lesson entirely. Wolf removed his leather glove and reached into his breast pocket, withdrawing a crumpled photograph of his wife and daughter standing before their home in Bavaria. The image was creased and faded from months of handling. He had looked at it before every major engagement since Normandy began 6 weeks earlier, a private ritual that grounded him before the chaos. He tucked it away carefully and replaced his glove. Above him, the sky was a dome of pale blue, empty and silent, too silent. In the distance, he could hear the sporadic crack of rifle fire and the occasional thump of artillery. But here in this moment, the world seemed suspended between heartbeats. His gunner, Franz, sat in the turret polishing the breech mechanism of the 75mm gun with methodical precision, the same motion he performed 1,000 times before. The loader checked and rechecked ammunition, armor-piercing rounds stacked like black pills of violence. Everything was ready. Everything was as it should be. Then came the sound. It began as a distant hum, almost imperceptible beneath the ambient noise of war, like the drone of angry insects carried on the wind. Within seconds it grew, a building crescendo that made experienced tankers freeze mid-motion. Wolf's head snapped upward. The sky to the north was changing, darkening, as if a thundercloud were racing toward them at impossible speed. But these were not clouds. Through the haze emerged a formation so vast, so geometrically perfect, that for a surreal moment it resembled a migratory flock of mechanical birds. Hundreds of them. The summer sun glinted off aluminum wings and perspex canopies. American fighter bombers, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts from the 362nd, 366, and 368 fighter groups, descending in waves like judgment rendered in aluminum and high-octane fuel. Wolf's throat tightened. "J-bows," he screamed, using the German slang for fighter bombers, his voice cracking with sudden adrenaline. Everybody out. Out! Around him, hatches burst open like spring flowers as crews abandoned their armored coffins and sprinted for the hedgerows. The Panther, that magnificent 50-ton masterpiece of German engineering, offered no protection against what was coming. Its thick frontal armor, designed to deflect armor-piercing shells at 1,000 meters, was meaningless now. The men ran. The Panzer-Lehr Division was not supposed to be vulnerable. Activated in January 1944 specifically to counter the anticipated Allied invasion, it was composed entirely of demonstration troops and instructors from Germany's armored schools, the professors of mechanized warfare turned students of destruction. Every man was a veteran. Every officer had commanded in combat. Their equipment was the finest the Reich could produce. 183 tanks, including 99 Panthers and Tigers, 612 armor vehicles, and enough firepower to obliterate entire regiments. When they rolled into Normandy in June, British intelligence officers who identified the division's insignia felt their stomachs drop. This was not some ad hoc formation scraped together from occupation troops and old men. This was the spear point of the Wehrmacht's armored doctrine-made manifest. They had reason for confidence. At Villers-Bocage on June 13th, a single Tiger tank commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Whitman had ambushed a British armored column and destroyed 25 vehicles in 15 minutes, throwing the entire British advance into chaos. The Panzer-Lehr had fought across every meter of Norman hedgerow country with stubborn ferocity, trading ground only when outflanked or overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They expected to face American and British armor in set-piece battles where training and tactical skill could compensate for the Allies' numerical superiority. They expected tank duels at dawn, artillery preparation, infantry assaults that could be repelled with disciplined machine gun fire. They expected war as they understood it. Violent, yes, but governed by certain immutable principles of engagement. What they had not expected, what no amount of training at Grafenwohr or combat experience on the Eastern Front could have prepared them for, was the industrialized annihilation descending from the Norman sky. The first P-47s rolled into their attack runs at 0949 hours. Each Thunderbolt carried two 500-pound general-purpose bombs beneath its wings and 8.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns in its wings, guns that could fire a combined total of 4,800 rounds per minute, each bullet heavy enough to punch through engine blocks and shatter armor plate welds. The pilots had trained for this. At bases in England, they had practiced skip bombing and dive bombing against mock-ups of German armor until the approach angles were burned into muscle memory. They knew the vulnerable points, engine decks, turret rings, ammunition stowage hatches. They knew to aim for the fuel tanks. The first wave came in low and fast, barely clearing the hedgerow tops, their engines screaming like banshees. Wolfe, pressed flat into a roadside ditch with his face buried in French soil that smelled of manure and iron, heard the horrifying shriek of aircraft engines at full throttle, followed by the distinctive womp-womp-womp of .50 caliber fire walking across the road. The sound was unlike anything else in war, a rhythmic hammering so rapid it blurred into a continuous roar, punctuated by the sharp crack of bullets striking steel. Then came the bombs. The first 500-pounder hit 30 meters ahead of Wolfe's position, detonating against a Panther tank, with a flash of orange fire and a concussion wave that slammed into his chest like a giant's fist. The explosion was not merely loud. It was a physical force that compressed the air, crushed the lungs, rattled teeth and skulls. Wolfe felt his ears pop, and suddenly all sound became muffled, wrapped in cotton. Through the haze of dirt and smoke, he saw the Panther, a moment ago a symbol of German technical supremacy, transformed into a burning wreck. The turret had been blown completely off its ring and lay upside down 3 meters away, smoke pouring from every opening. The hull burned with an intense white heat as ammunition cooked off inside, sending tracer rounds ricocheting into the sky like dying fireworks. Another P-47 Dove, and another bomb fell. This one struck an ammunition half-track, and the resulting detonation was apocalyptic. A column of flames shot 40 meters into the air, expanding into a mushroom cloud of black smoke threaded with chains of secondary explosions as shells detonated in sequence. The blast wave rolled across the sunken lane, overturning a motorcycle and hurling fragments of twisted metal in every direction. Wolfe pressed himself deeper into the earth, his hands clawing at the soil as if he could burrow into it like an animal. For 11 minutes, the world ended. The after-action report filed by the U.S. 9 Tactical Air Command recorded the engagement with bureaucratic precision. Mission 44 to 198. Target: enemy armor concentration vicinity, St. Lo. Time on target: 0949 to 1,000 hours. Aircraft committed: 246 P-47 Thunderbolts. Ordnance expended: 492 500-pound GP bombs, 147,600.50 cal rounds. Results: 34 enemy tanks destroyed, 26 damaged. 41 armored vehicles destroyed. 18 trucks destroyed. Negligible enemy AA fire. All aircraft returned to base. Those numbers, typed neatly on a form by a clerk at a desk in England, could not capture the experience of those 11 minutes. They could not describe the sensory overload of continuous explosions overlapping into a single sustained roar. They could not convey the psychological terror of being utterly helpless, of knowing that your survival depended entirely on chance, whether the next bomb fell 3 meters to the left or 3 meters to the right. The men of Panzer-Lehr, who had faced Soviet artillery barges at Kursk and British tank charges in the desert, discovered a new kind of fear in that roadside ditch. It was a fear of industrial annihilation, of being reduced to raw materials by an enemy who possessed not just more guns and more tanks, but an entirely different conception of warfare's possibilities. When the last P-47 pulled up and banked away to the north, trailing exhaust smoke, the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Wolf lifted his head slowly, ears still ringing, and looked upon a landscape transformed. Where an hour ago had stood a fully operational armored column, Panthers, Panzer IVs, half-tracks, supply trucks, the mobile infrastructure of modern mechanized warfare, now lay a graveyard. Vehicles burned the length of the road, sending up columns of oily black smoke that merged into a single dark pillar visible for kilometers. The acrid stench of burning rubber, diesel, and flesh filled the air. A Panther tank lay on its side like a dying beetle, one track blown completely off, ammunition still cooking off inside with muffled pops. Further down the road, a half-track had been torn nearly in half, its rear section completely disintegrated, the front end leaning at an impossible angle against a shattered hedgerow. Wolf rose to his knees, then to his feet, moving mechanically. His uniform was caked with dirt. Blood ran from his nose, ruptured vessels from the overpressure. Around him, other men were emerging from cover like shell-shocked ghosts, their faces blank with incomprehension. Franz stood beside what remained of their Panther, staring at the wreckage. The tank's engine deck had been perforated by .50 caliber fire, each bullet hole the diameter of a man's thumb, the armor that should protect it torn like paper. Fuel was leaking from the ruptured tanks, mixing with hydraulic fluid to form rainbow puddles in the dirt. "We have to move," Wolf said, but his voice sounded distant even to himself. "Regroup, get to the secondary position." The words were automatic, the response to training reasserting itself over shock. But when he tried to take stock of his force, the reality became unavoidable. Of the 18 panzers that had been positioned in this sector that morning, 11 were burning or destroyed. Of the remaining 7, 4 damaged badly enough to require field workshops that no longer existed because the recovery vehicles had also been hit. They had lost perhaps 40 men killed or wounded in 11 minutes, more casualties than the entire division had taken in some weeks of grinding hedgerow combat. But worse than the material losses was what had been broken inside the survivors. These were not green conscripts who could be excused for panic. These were veterans who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk, men who had seen the worst that industrial warfare could offer and had endured. Yet in those 11 minutes, something fundamental had shifted. They had encountered a force that rendered their expertise irrelevant, their armor worthless, their tactical doctrine obsolete. In the command post 3 kilometers to the rear, Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of Panzer-Lehr, received the casualty reports with mounting horror. A Prussian officer of the old school, Bayerlein had served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa and had commanded armored formations across 2 fronts. He understood tactical realities. When his staff officers laid out the butcher's bill from the morning's airstrikes, not just from Wolf's sector, but from multiple positions across the division's entire front, he stared at the map in silence for a long moment. In a single morning, his division had lost nearly a third of its operational armor, not to enemy tanks or anti-tank guns, but to aircraft. Aircraft that could strike anywhere, anytime, with virtually no warning and overwhelming violence. "We cannot continue offensive operations under these conditions," he finally said, his voice carefully controlled. "Recommend immediate withdrawal to defensive positions with overhead cover." The words were bitter ash in his mouth. The Panzer-Lehr did not retreat. They were Germany's best, the sword tip of the Wehrmacht's counteroffensive that was supposed to drive the Allies back into the sea. But even the best sword was useless if it could be shattered by a hammer before ever reaching the enemy. The withdrawal order went out at 1,400 hours. The remains of the Panzer-Lehr pulled back to the hedgerows, moving only at night, hiding their tanks under trees and camouflage nets during daylight hours like fugitives. The division that had rolled into Normandy with 183 tanks would, by the end of July, count fewer than 30 operational panzers. The rest had been destroyed or abandoned, victims not of heroic tank duels, but an enemy who had solved the problem of armored warfare by simply attacking from a dimension the panzers could not reach. In the weeks that followed, as news of the St. Lo airstrike spread to Wehrmacht, it carried with it a psychological contamination more destructive than the bombs themselves. German tank crews began painting extra foliage on their vehicles, draping them with branches until they resembled moving bushes. They refused to advance during daylight. Officers reported increasing cases of Jabberskreck, fighter-bomber shock, a condition where experienced tankers would freeze or panic at the sound of aircraft engines, even friendly ones. The Luftwaffe, which was supposed to protect ground forces from exactly this kind of attack, had long since been swept from the Norman skies by overwhelming Allied fighter superiority. German soldiers learned to time their movements by weather. Overcast skies became a blessing, clear days a curse. This was a terrible arithmetic of American industrial power made manifest. The P-47 Thunderbolts that destroyed Wolfe's column represented just a tiny fraction of the assets available. The United States was producing fighter aircraft at a rate of more than 5,000 per month by mid-1944, a number that exceeded the entire Luftwaffe's operational strength on the Western Front. Each bomb dropped on a German tank was replaceable within hours from supply depots that stretched back through an unbroken logistics chain across the Atlantic to factories in Pennsylvania and Ohio. The pilots who flew those missions, if shot down, would be replaced by graduates from training programs that produced more new aviators each month than Germany could train in a year. The Germans had entered Normandy believing that tactical excellence and superior training could overcome material disadvantage, that the quality of their soldiers and equipment would prove decisive. What they discovered instead was that past a certain threshold, quantity has a quality all its own. When your enemy can afford to lose 10 tanks for every one you destroy, when they can replace destroyed aircraft faster than you can shoot them down, when they can call upon airstrikes measured in hundreds of sorties against targets you must defend with dozens of anti-aircraft guns, the mathematics become inexorable. Excellence is ground down by abundance. Skill is smothered by surplus. Heinrich Wolf survived the St-Lo airstrike and the subsequent Normandy campaign. He would survive the retreat through France, the desperate fighting in the Rhineland, and eventually the war's end. In 1948, 3 years after surrender, he was interviewed by an American military historian researching the effectiveness of tactical air power. The historian asked him to describe his experiences in Normandy. Wolf was silent for a long moment, staring at a point on the wall beyond the interviewer's shoulder. "We had the best tanks," he said finally, "the best training, the best doctrine. None of it mattered. You Americans didn't fight us tank against tank, soldier against soldier. You fought us factory against factory, economy against economy. And we had already lost that war before the first soldier landed on the beach. We just didn't know it yet." The historian noted this down dutifully and moved on to his next question. But Wolfe's observation cut to the heart of something larger than any single battle or campaign. The 11 minutes above St-Lo represented more than a tactical defeat. They represented a collision of two fundamentally different systems of war, one based on operational excellence and resource scarcity, the other on industrial supremacy and material abundance. In that collision, excellence had not merely been defeated, it had been rendered irrelevant. Today, the fields around St-Lo are green and peaceful, divided by the same ancient hedgerows that made them such difficult terrain in 1944. French farmers till soil that still occasionally yields fragments of that war, twisted pieces of aluminum, rusted tank tracks, unexploded ordnance that must be carefully removed by specialists. A small memorial stands near the site of the airstrike, a simple stone marker with a plaque listing the names of villages liberated in the subsequent advance. Tourists occasionally stop to read it, take photographs, and drive on. But in the summer of 1944, in 11 minutes of fire and thunder, the arc of history bent. A generation of German soldiers who had been raised on stories of tactical brilliance and military prowess, who had been taught that skill and courage could overcome any obstacle, learned the terrifying lesson of industrial warfare's true nature. They learned that in a contest between craftsmanship and mass production, between tactical genius and overwhelming material power, the factories will always win. They learned in the scream of diving aircraft, in the hammer of .50 caliber fire, in the flash of bombs that turned steel fortresses into burning coffins. And in learning it, they discovered a truth that would define the rest of the century, that modern war is not won by heroes or tactics or brilliant generals, but by logistics, by production lines, by the cold mathematics of industrial capacity. The 11-minute airstrike above St-Lo was not an aberration. It was a future in which abundance itself becomes the ultimate weapon, and no amount of skill or courage can stand against the simple, crushing reality of more. More planes, more bombs, more fuel, more steel, more of everything. In that roadside ditch, pressed into French soil with the earth shaking around him and the sky falling in fire, Heinrich Wolf and his comrades learned what American power truly meant. Not democracy, not freedom, not ideology, just more. And in the calculus of total war, more was everything. The smoke from burning panzers rose into the summer sky and drifted east, a dark pillar marking the grave of an illusion